Hi, everyone. First of all, I got to say, it's fantastic to see so many people here who have an interest in these old hangars. Like, sometimes you feel so alone. Like, why doesn't nobody else care about this stuff like I do? I'm glad to hear it. And so, yeah, like you said, I've been fortunate to be an employee at the Fort MacArthur Museum for the past 19 years, and I've just learned so much about World War II stuff and gotten such a detailed look at some of the defenses that we had in place, and I want to share that with you today. So I'm not an expert on LTA stuff. I'm a fan, and so I'm sure everybody in this room has something floating around in their head that they can teach me about the hangars here that I've never heard before. But I've been gleaning as much information as I can to sort of fit into the broader context of what I know. So the objective from my talk today isn't necessarily to teach you the details, but to give you a broader perspective on things that most people have never even heard about. So, and to teach how that would be relevant to our local history with the hangars and everything else. Also to give a better background on the origins of the LTA program, and definitely to spread awareness of what the Japanese and the Germans were, what threat they brought to the West Coast and to the East Coast during World War II. All right, so the origins of LTA. It goes all the way back to 1783 when the French figured out that hot gases will lift stuff into the air if it's light enough. And so September 19th, 1783, the Montgolfier brothers launched a balloon from Versailles, and I guess you could argue that is the first time that man ever took flight off of the Earth. So for its first flight, it flew about 8 minutes and reached a height of about a mile. And so, what's that?
Did it land at all?
Yeah, it did land.
It's still up there.
Yeah. I think like something fell over. I don't know the details on that one. Like I said, I'm learning a lot about this subject as I'm putting this together. So have you ever heard of Mount Lowe in Pasadena? Anybody here? So Mount Lowe is famous from the Pacific Electric days when they had the funicular railway to take people up to this mountain resort owned by the PE. And Mount Lowe is named for Thaddeus Lowe, who during the Civil War was the chief aeronaut of the U.S. Army Balloon Corps. So we weren't the first to use balloons in a military fashion. That title goes to the French, using balloons in the Napoleonic Wars and stuff like that. But for the United States, the first time it was used as a military weapon, so to speak, or I should say an ISR platform for surveilling the enemy, was with the U.S. Army Balloon Corps. And so it was just like today we have the CIA, which is a civilian branch of our government, to compile information for national defense. The U.S. Army Balloon Corps was also a civilian contracted organization, and they deployed balloons about 3,000 times in the early 1860s. The Confederate Army tried it, but they only did it around 10 times. And the balloons helped the Union Army gain a tactical advantage and drove Confederate troops to try to mask their movements and spend energy in sort of putting forward a false front, like misinformation with moving troops around to make them look like you got more people and all that. Battle of Chancellorsville, May 1863, marked the last battle that the U.S. Army Balloon Corps was used. But there was an important person who came all the way from Germany to see how the U.S. Army Balloon Corps was being fielded. Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin. I'm sure everybody in here has heard the name Zeppelin before. Well, he was really hot on the idea of using lighter than air aircraft for all kinds of purposes, but he, after he retired from the Army, he started the Zeppelin Corp, which actually still exists today, still making airships. And his idea was to create a steerable airship. And so the very first Zeppelin, the LZ-1, was first flown from Constance Lake near in southern Germany on the 2nd of July 1900. But come World War I, Zeppelins were turned into long-range bombers. And today we think of Zeppelins as being, blimps as just being some silly thing you see over football games to advertise beer and tires and things like that. But it's almost crazy to wrap your head around the fact that these were fearsome weapons during World War I. And they had 40 guys in some cases as the crew, with gunners and mechanics, and these were basically ships of the air. And it took a lot to be able to turn them into this. The aircraft they were using to intercept these things, it took them like 45 minutes of circling just to get up to the altitude where they could intercept these things. And they would strafe these Zeppelins to no avail. Nothing could bring these things down. They would drop their bombs and be on their merry way. Plus, Zeppelins could fly higher than any of those interceptor aircraft could. And they developed special incendiary bullets just for shooting down Zeppelins, and they still didn't work. And so they developed explosive bullets with nitroglycerin in them to bring the Zeppelins down, and they would have the flaming bullet intermixed with the explosive bullet. And despite all that, they still couldn't get these things to come down. And then finally, one guy had the idea, instead of strafing the whole thing, I'll just focus my fire. And by doing that, he created a big enough hole for the hydrogen to mix with the oxygen and combust. And that's how you get the scene you see in this picture here. One of my favorite shoot-down stories, though, of World War I was the L-33. Anybody know that story? What happened to the L-33? So after dropping their bombs on London, the interceptors came, and they hit it enough where it had a slow descent. And so the commander of the L-33 knew they weren't going to make it back to Germany. They weren't even going to make it across the English Channel. And so as it settled down in the English countryside, the whole crew survived the landing. They all got out, and they set their airship on fire, which is why it's a skeleton like you see in this picture. And then they all, in true German fashion, got into their formations and marched towards what they thought was the coast. And a single British police officer confronted them. And the commander of the German group said, "Pardon me, which way to the coast?" And the cop said, "Sorry, boys, you're going to have to forget about the coast and come with me." And he was riding a bicycle. It's just totally absurd scene. But they were the only Germans to march on English soil during the First World War. Armed Germans. So there was another one of these that was shot down over France. But they weren't able to destroy it in time, and so it was captured by the Western powers. And that was the first time American officials got a good look at one of these Zeppelins and decided, we want one. And so in the early 1920s, in the post-war era, the United States made movements towards getting their own Zeppelins. And because of war reparations at the end of World War I, they had an agreement that Germany, the Zeppelin Corps, was going to build an airship for the United States. And that airship was eventually completed and became the USS Los Angeles. But they were so slow in making the airship that the United States got tired of waiting and decided to build our own, and that's where the Shenandoah came from. And so, also the first airship base of all of them, the oldest with the most airship history, is Naval Air Station Lakehurst, New Jersey, and it was founded in what, the 20s? That's one of the things I missed getting into here. So there's the USS Shenandoah, which was, again, built in the United States in those early post-World War I years. And also note the high mast and the scale. But the USS Shenandoah was brought down by extreme weather over Ohio. And people came from all over to see the remains. In fact, the farmer that owned the land that it landed on was charging people admission. And there's the USS Los Angeles. And again, I think it was 1923 when they had this incident where there was this huge updraft that lifted the tail of that thing straight up into the sky, vertical. And you know, it's a cute picture, but it's just, when you really think about how big that is and how high that, like that tower itself is like 120 feet high. And so you can just imagine just being on the ground looking up at that thing. That's the magic of this era of the dirigibles is, you know, these were giants roaming the earth, essentially.
Where was this taken?
I believe that was Lakehurst, New Jersey that happened. And they did many experiments with the dirigibles. So here is the USS Los Angeles landing on an aircraft carrier. It's, again, quite a sight seeing it take up the whole entire deck space. I don't know what they did to keep it from swinging into the island. And then the USS Patoka, which was a replenishment oiler, was developed in 1924 to be an airship tender. And so they did all kinds of fleet exercises to try and figure out the best way to use these massive airships. Some people wanted to use these things for reconnaissance. They even had the idea of turning them into aircraft carriers. So the Akron and the Macon were built a little bit later in the early 30s, and they were built to be able to launch little airplanes, so spoiler. And they had a hangar deck in there where that they would drop the whole airplane down on a gantry, and it could take off, and it had a hook on it, and it would come back and hook back on. And even though, you know, that concept didn't move far beyond the dirigible testing in the 30s, they tried it again in the 1950s with B-36 Peacemakers and a little tiny custom-made jet. I forget the name of the jet, but it was pretty funny looking. But anyway, the Akron, just like the Shenandoah, was sort of ripped apart in a storm. And an actual, first of all, I should have clarified, does this crowd know the difference between a dirigible and a blimp? No. Great. So a dirigible has a rigid structure. So just like if we go back, a dirigible has all this framework in there to keep its shape, and then it's got gas bags inside for the lifting gas. Whereas a blimp, it is the bag. In other words, it doesn't have a rigid structure inside, and to keep its shape, they have what's called as ballonets, which expand and retract with the air pressure, because as you go up to thinner air, the shape of that's going to change. This is my little one, by the way. Oh, yeah, she'll careful, she'll try to steal the show. So anyway, a blimp, the J4, which you see is a really early type blimp, was also lost while looking for the survivors of the Akron. I believe that incident happened in the middle of the night. They hit a storm front, and they ended up trying to. So the wind like sheared off the tail, and it started sinking towards the ocean, and so they dropped a whole bunch of ballast quick, which sent it way up into the stratosphere, and then they had no way of controlling its descent from there. And there was a rear admiral on board, William Moffett, and Moffett Field up in Northern California is named after him, which was the first big West Coast dirigible base. And so enter the picture you see there. That's the USS Macon inside Hangar 1 there at Moffett Field. And also there's a picture of one of those special aircraft for docking with the Macon and the Akron. And so again, just like the Akron and the Shenandoah, a big storm caught the Macon by surprise, and she had a similar fate where, again, tried to drop ballast to keep from sinking, and went up and crashed down. And so the Macon crashed off Point Sur, California, and they recently relocated the wreck, and there's some great pictures online of the remains of what's down there. And this particular picture is one of those Sparrowhawk parasite aircraft that were inside the Macon. So getting back to Naval Air Station Lakehurst, New Jersey, it was commissioned June 28th, 1921, and that's where like the main LTA school was, oldest and largest LTA base, and site of the Hindenburg disaster, May 6, 1937. I believe that was static electricity that built up, and when she got close to the mast, it combusted. There's probably more details on that somebody with a deeper knowledge base can give you, but that's my surface level knowledge. Also, kind of a, crazy to see swastika on U.S. soil under friendly terms. And another one that you see the picture in the bottom right with the Cobra. That's a more modern picture, obviously, but it shows hangars 1 through 6. Although I'm not sure where Hangar 4 is. Hangar 4 is kind of smaller, and they used it for free balloons for the most part. But you see in the foreground those two big long hangars there are the same as we have here in Tustin. And there she is again, colorized, and there's another airship in the background. So Moffett Field, Naval Air Station Sunnyvale. Construction began October 5th, 1931. In this picture up here, you can see in the background, again, the same World War II era wooden hangars like we have here. And Moffett Field actually still pretty much looks like that today. It's a really neat place to visit. The only thing is the skin has been taken off of Hangar 1 there, and it has been that way for like a decade now. Allegedly, Google bought the hangar and they were supposed to do something with it, but that project's been stalled for a long time. Although I heard recently that they're sandblasting the framework as of late. So anyway, commissioned April 12th, 1933, home to the USS Macon until she was lost on February 12th, 1935. And then after the Macon was lost, the U.S. Army Air Corps took over the base. They used it for training and storage of aircraft. And then the United States Navy took it back in 1942 for LTA operations. And there's another picture from the other side. You can see those hangars a little more closely. Also note the ammunition storage area. So I think this is a post-war photograph. In the upper corner here, you can see the NASA wind tunnel, which is also still used today. And this is a picture I took when I visited there. There's actually a really great museum on the base. For anybody who has an interest in LTA history, I highly recommend checking out the museum up there and making the pilgrimage up to Moffett Field. On my bucket list too, I'd also like to go see NAS Lakehurst. If I could help it, I'd go visit all the LTA sites. So during World War II, the military kind of gave up on blimps dirigibles after the Macon disaster. And when World War II loomed on the horizon, they made a concerted effort towards blimps. There's a lot of people who went to bat to try to keep the dirigible program alive, but just then as today, you know, you got political interests that got in the way. And it makes me wonder, you know, what the LTA program could have achieved with dirigibles, you know, if it wasn't for politics. So anyway, these were the primarily used blimps of the Navy during World War II. This isn't all the different classes of blimps, but these are the mainstay of the Navy fleet. So the L-class blimp is kind of like your standard Goodyear blimp that you remember seeing as a kid. Nowadays we got some funky, it's actually more of a true dirigible, but smaller than the historic ones that they use for the Goodyear blimp today. But and here's some of the other bases that were built in the lead up to World War II. So Naval Air Station South Weymouth, Massachusetts, you'll notice it's got two different types of hangars. It's got a steel hangar built more like the Macon's hangar at Moffett Field, and then another one of our standard wood frame hangars like we have here. And then so does Naval Air Station Weeksfield, North Carolina. One steel, one wood hangar. Commissioned April 1st, 1942. The other one was commissioned March 1st, 1942. And there's a couple of pictures inside and with some blimps out on the mat. And so let me talk about the Army for a minute. Like I said, the LTA program was just part of the greater defense of the homeland during World War II. And so in charge of the harbor defenses of Los Angeles was Fort MacArthur. Now, the Fort MacArthur had the Harbor Entrance Harbor Defense Command Post, which was run jointly by the Army and the Navy. And the Joint Operations Center for Southern California Sector was in the 11th Naval District Headquarters down in San Diego, the building of which was just torn down last year. But Fort MacArthur had giant guns, so every major harbor in the country had a coastal defense fort. Fort MacArthur had 4 of these 14-inch disappearing guns, 2 14-inch railway guns. But by the time World War II, even during the attack on Pearl Harbor, these guns were already considered kind of antiquated. Because like the disappearing guns, for example, the one in the pit there, that was designed before combat aircraft was even a thing. And so you'd see it looking straight down on it, it looked like a bullseye. But it was all they had to defend the harbor, so they put camouflage netting over the top, put the anti-aircraft guns around, and started building newer, more modern gun emplacements. And here's some of those, like the 16-inch guns we had. There were 2 16-inch batteries they built here for the harbor defenses of Los Angeles. There was one right here in Orange County at Bolsa Chica State Beach, and the other one was in San Pedro. And the other picture is an 8-inch railway gun, which we had up in Manhattan Beach. They had special buildings that slid over the top of the guns for camouflage. So by 1944, this is sort of the majority of how the harbor defenses of Los Angeles was laid out. So you see we've got searchlight positions and observation stations, and there's artillery batteries all over the place. Right, so this is the harbor right here. And over half of the nation's aircraft production capacity was right here in Southern California during World War II. And many vital wartime industries besides. Right here in Orange County and throughout LA County, there's oil fields. They were a lot more conspicuous in those days than they are now. But tons of oil fields, at least 4 major refineries, not to mention the huge shipbuilding operations and many other industrial activities, and the huge civil population. So Los Angeles was important to defend. Long Beach Naval Station and Shipyard, they started construction in 1941, and the very first thing they built was the Navy Net Depot and Net Pier. So this was for constructing and deploying anti-submarine nets And this whole section, I mean, including the airfield, became the shipyard. You can even see some of the dry docks under construction there. And it was a huge operation. And it was closed and completely demolished in the 90s. But those Navy anti-submarine nets became so massive and unwieldy and they needed more of that space than I think they had on the shipyard, so they ended up building Seal Beach Naval Weapons Station and Net Depot. And for you old-timers, not pointing any fingers, but some of you ought to remember driving down PCH and seeing these gigantic buoys. Those were for the anti-submarine and torpedo nets of World War II that were across the harbor entrance. And I guess people would call them up all the time like, oh, those bombs are going to explode. And it's like, they're not bombs, they're buoys. And so one of the things I've studied pretty well in depth is the chronology of enemy attacks during World War II. So this is excerpts from the Western Defense Command history from World War II. And it goes over each ship that was attacked by a Japanese submarine in one way or the other, and also through some of the shore installations that were bombarded. So who here knew that there were Japanese submarines sinking ships off the coast here within sight of land? 2, 3, okay. Yeah, I mean, for us today, most people have no idea. It's not exactly something that's like an important subject in school these days. So of these, I'm not going to go over every single one, but each one has its own very interesting story. The SS Samoa and Agawald were attacked, but they survived. But the SS Amidio was the first ship to be sunk off the west coast by enemy activity. So Japanese submarine torpedoed the Amidio, and 5 merchant sailors were killed in that attack. I read one account where one fellow who was in the engine room said that the torpedo actually came through the bulkhead so close he could have touched it and flew to the other side of the engine room and exploded and killed 2 guys over there and knocked him out the hole, according to his account. But either way, aside from the 5 men who were killed, the rest of the crew abandoned ship, and they ended up rowing like 24 hours through a heavy rainstorm, like to get to shore. It was pretty ridiculous. And the ship actually didn't sink. It drifted 60 miles up the coast and washed up onto the rocks of Crescent City, California, where there's still a piece of its hull on display today. And this is a picture I took myself. So that is a picture of the piece of the hull that's still left there. It's got memorial plaque and stuff. And there she is, beached on the rocks there, Crescent City, California. The SS Montebello was another famous one where, again, within sight of land in broad daylight, this Japanese submarine surfaced, fired 2 torpedoes. The first one allegedly was a dud, and the second one exploded on the only hold that wasn't full of crude oil. And so the ship ended up taking about 3 million barrels of crude oil with it down to the bottom of the ocean. And so, but before it sank, the crew abandoned ship. The sub-commander decided it wasn't sinking fast enough, so he surfaced his submarine, and they manned the deck gun and actually shelled the Montebello as they're getting into the life rafts. You know, there's shrapnel going on everywhere. There's men injured, but they were able to get the whole crew into the life rafts, and they're rowing to shore, and they actually raked the lifeboats with machine gun fire from the submarine. But despite all that, there were no fatalities on that attack. Thank goodness. But fast forward to the 1960s, remember I said one of those torpedoes ended up being a dud? Well, in the 1960s, a fishing trawler actually picked it up in its net, allegedly, and so now that dud torpedo that hit the Montebello but didn't explode is on display at the Maritime Museum in San Diego. And that's what this picture is. It's a model of the ship with the torpedo underneath. And so right here in the Los Angeles area, Christmas Eve of 1941, there were 2 ships that were attacked. So at 4:30 in the morning, the Navy's magnetic anomaly detector cable detected the presence of a submarine in the channel. And then about 6:30 in the morning, the SS Barbara Olson, which was a commercial freighter going down to San Diego through the Catalina Channel, was nobody saw a submarine, but they saw the wake of the torpedo headed right for it, and it went right underneath and exploded on the other side. And so the Barbara Olson made it safely to her destination, but she was nearly hit by a Japanese Navy torpedo. And then, because of that, the Navy dispatched a destroyer up from San Diego, or a subchaser, I should say. It wasn't a true destroyer. And so that was the Barbara Olson that was attacked at 6:30 in the morning. 10:30 a.m. the same day, the SS Absaroka, which was a lumber freighter out of the Columbia River area, was coming into the harbor entrance of Los Angeles and was struck by a Japanese torpedo about a mile off the point. And so again, within sight of land in broad daylight, and about 10:30 is when that subchaser arrived on scene. The first response to the Absaroka being torpedoed was for some patrol aircraft out of NAS Terminal Island took off to look for it. And so remember, Fort MacArthur is there with giant guns ready to shoot any offending ships out there. But the submarine never presented a target. You know, nobody saw the periscope. But it was able to aim its torpedo using nothing but the periscope, then disappear and just listen to sonar to see if they hit it. And so because it was torpedoed so close to shore, it didn't sink completely. It was sort of settled down and the waves crashed across its deck. 1 merchant sailor was killed in that attack. That subchaser that I mentioned earlier dropped 32 depth charges in the last known location of that submarine trying to blow it up. And they had no idea of knowing whether they got it or not. The next day, Christmas Day of 1941, somebody reported that they saw periscopes sticking out of the water off Redondo Beach, on the other side of the peninsula over there. And so they figured maybe they damaged it. It was hiding over there making repairs. So Battery C of the 105th Field Artillery Regiment took a 75 millimeter gun from Fort MacArthur, parked it on the end of the Redondo Beach Pier, and fired 10 rounds at the suspected submarine. So this is the subchaser, the USS Amethyst, that dropped the 32 depth charges in the last known location of that submarine. And because it didn't completely sink, they were able to raise it and eventually tow it into the harbor for repairs. And so this picture on the right there is Jane Russell, the actress. She's famous for torpedoes in her own right. But that's a picture of her standing in the torpedo hole holding a loose-lipped sink ships poster. So that's right here in LA where a ship got torpedoed, and a famous actress standing there for your propaganda needs. And then this is from the History of the Harbor Defenses of Los Angeles pamphlet. It shows the approximate position from which Battery F 105th Field Artillery fired that 75 millimeter gun from the Redondo Beach Pier at that suspected submarine. Now, interviews from the veterans who were involved with that said that it turned out to be a piece of floating trash. They didn't actually get the submarine. So supposedly there was a storm the night before that ripped the roof off of a barge or something, and it had a stovepipe sticking out of it, and it was half submerged. But they fired on it 10 rounds, so they couldn't see it anymore. And so they were still awarded for their action firing against a Japanese submarine, even though it wasn't necessarily really a submarine. All right, so February 23rd, 1942. How many of you have heard of this before? 7 o'clock in the evening, during Roosevelt's fireside chat, a Japanese submarine, the I-17, I want to say, it might be 15, surfaced off of Elwood oil field just northwest of Santa Barbara and fired 25 shots from its 5.5-inch deck gun at the oil field, trying to blow up big storage tankers and stuff. And so, they're shooting out of the setting sun, and then early the next morning, the Army and the press show up to investigate. It's a big madhouse, and so that's where you got these pictures of press reporters and the Army and everybody crawling around. And so this picture on the right there is the closest any of those shells came to actually hitting one of those tanks. Their aim was horrible. And so they only ended up doing about, what, $500 worth of damage total. But still, 25 shots fired on the mainland of the United States by a Japanese submarine. That's still pretty scary stuff. And so, here's some more images. You can see the picture on the right there, broken pieces of a pumping unit. And I love her snappy suit. And so yeah, this was a coastal oil field. Now, the Western Defense Command history literally says that they had some temporary field artillery mounts in that general area that they moved away the day before that happened. And then local citizens reported that they saw flashing lights from the shore to the submarine and back. And so this was one of the incidents that really implicated or made people afraid that there were Japanese saboteurs that were aiding the submarine. There were other incidents besides, but this was one of the biggest ones that made the most headlines. There was like the Nihao incident, which that's a crazy story if you ever get the chance to look that up. And so another account I read was where these Life magazine reporters showed up, and the Army wasn't letting them in at that point, but they found one of these exploded shells just laying on the ground, and they held it up and took a picture. And so I was kind of surprised when I actually found the picture. And there's one of the witnesses that they interviewed. And so this area is completely changed. The oil field is gone. There's a golf course there now, but there's a beautiful old Spanish-style gas station that was there, and it's still there to this day. The restaurant that this woman worked in and that this guy is sitting next to is gone, but that gas station is there, and it's worth, if you're ever going up the 101, take a stop, check it out, and just sort of wrap your head around the fact that this is one spot that was shelled by an enemy submarine. There's plaques around the area, like if you want to walk the golf course and the bluffs and stuff, but to me the most interesting artifact is that gas station. And so, a little more than a day later, at 2 o'clock in the morning, February 25th, 1942, 1,433 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition were fired in the sky over Los Angeles at a perceived threat of enemy aircraft. Some people thought that maybe the attack on Elwood oil field might have been a diversion or preparation for a broader invasion. And so thousands of small arms rounds were fired over the sky. Like 5 people ended up dying, like 2 from heart attacks and 3 more from car accidents. It was, it was a calamity. I met one woman she was a kid in those days, and they heard the explosions going on outside, and she thought it might have been their water heater that was bubbling, because some of those older water heaters, they used to make that kind of noise. Anyway, it's just kind of funny to imagine the chaos and the calamity that must have happened that night. And so another important incident, shelling of Fort Stevens. June 21st, 1942, a few minutes before midnight, another Japanese Navy submarine surfaced off the mouth of the Columbia River. That's between Washington and Oregon states there on the Pacific coast, and fired 15 shots at Fort Stevens, Oregon. So there were coast artillery batteries there that were ready to shoot back. And the guys, jumped out of bed, and they manned the guns in their underwear. And the guns were tripped into battery, ready to fire. But nobody gave the order to return fire. And I suspect that might have had to do a little bit with the air raid, where they shot thousands of rounds off over Los Angeles for no reason. And then they were actually getting shelled by a Japanese submarine, and nobody could find somebody high enough to say, yes, return fire. So, that was a huge blow to the morale of the Coast Artillery Corps, and, a bunch of guys went over the hill that night, said, the hell with this, I'm joining the infantry. And so, again, it was a media circus, people, press showing up and looking for fragments of shells and all that. So the submarine that shelled Fort Stevens, Oregon, that was the I-25. The I-25 was an aircraft carrying submarine. Japan is the only nation to use aircraft carrying submarines in wartime. They're not the only nation to experiment with it, like the British experimented with the idea in the 1920s. But September 9th, 1942, the I-25 launched their little airplane, and they dropped incendiary bombs in the forest near Brookings, Oregon, to see if they can start a forest fire to draw manpower away from the war effort and sow panic and discord. And it was unseasonably wet at the time that they did that, so the fire didn't really catch on. And you see what would happen, how that would work, is this bulbous section in front of the conning tower had watertight clamshell doors that would open up. They'd pull the aircraft out, attach the wings and the floats, and they would launch it with this catapult, like you see in the picture there. And then you notice that crane. Well, the airplane, after it did its mission, it would land on the floats, and they'd use that crane to put it back on, put the wings and the floats back off, and put the whole thing back in the watertight hangar and close the doors. So as you can imagine, it leaves the sub exposed for a very long time. But I suspect the reason that they did it was because they wanted to prove the concept. Because after that, they built a whole new class of submarine, the 400 class, which could carry 3 aircraft each. These were the biggest submarines ever built in the world at that time. They basically took 2 regular submarines and put them together in a single hull. They could carry 3 aircraft each. But they weren't completed until 1945. Only 2 made it to the sea. 3 were completed, 2 made it to the sea. And so the original plan was to send them to go bomb the locks of the Panama Canal. But they found out that the invasion of the home islands of Japan was imminent. There were 10 aircraft carriers staged off Ulithi Atoll. And so they changed their plan to go attack the staging area off Ulithi Atoll. But before they got there, the atomic bombs were dropped. And so they ended up turning around and surrendering with the rest of the forces. But the Soviet Union declared war on Japan 1 week before the atomic bombs were dropped. And there's no way that the United States wanted the Soviets to get their hands on these things. So they inspected them real quick and sunk them, like almost immediately. So I bring all that stuff up so you know why anti-submarine warfare capability was so important. Construction commenced on Naval Air Station Santa Ana, April 1st, 1942. And so, you know, that's sort of in the midst of that submarine campaign. And while the hangars are being built, November 28th, 1942, a P-38 crashed into one of those big concrete towers that was meant to support the doors. And some people say there's still parts of the P-38 embedded in the concrete today, though of course you're never going to find any evidence of that. But either way, there's still records that, you know, an airplane crashed and a pilot died. And then January 23rd, 1943, during construction, the Santa Ana winds, which we're all familiar with, blew a bunch of the trusses down while they were trying to build this thing. But despite all that, October 1st, 1942, the Naval Air Station was officially commissioned. And the first airship to land at Naval Air Station Santa Ana was the L-8. I found this kind of shocking. I was familiar with the L-8 from another incident. August 16th, 1942, the L-8 crashed in Daly City, California. And this is one of the biggest mysteries of World War II. Because when they went to rescue the crew after the Blimp crashed, they weren't there. There's no reason why the crew shouldn't have been there. Like the radios were still on. You know, it was just, nobody can figure this out, why the crew disappeared. They think that maybe something broke on the engine or something and somebody leaned out to fix it and he fell and the other guy fell trying to save him or something. But the pilot and the co-pilot were never found. It was a 2-man crew. And interestingly enough, her last radio call was to say that she was going to inspect an oil slick near the Farallon Islands, which is outside the San Francisco Bay. And so there were other ships out there that saw the Blimp circling around the Farallon Islands. And then some witnesses saw it heading inland, but it seemed to be in control. But then by the time it got near Daly City, people could see that the bag was sagging in the middle, and it looked like a very sick airship. And then it started dragging on the ground, and one of the depth charges actually fell off and like rolled away as it's dragging along the ground, and it finally crashed on a residential street in Daly City. Now, can you imagine, coming home to that in the middle of a war, no less? But the depth charge was safely recovered. Nobody was hurt from that, but still nobody could figure out what the heck happened to the crew. But despite all that, the first airship to be docked in the hangar at Naval Air Station Santa Ana was on October 9th, 1942. And Naval Air Station Santa Ana was the home of Airship Squadron 31, ZP-31. And here is, a brief list of some of their more notable achievements, and I got all those from this book available at this very museum. So just to read some of those off to you, March 14th, 1943, K-20 made the squadron's first anti-submarine warfare attack. October 9th, 1942, K-99 dropped depth charges on a suspected sub. So now, you may laugh at the Army for shooting at a submarine that wasn't really a submarine. Well, the K-20, that one turned out like they saw an oil slick, which could have been evidence of a submarine down there, but it turned out to be natural seepage where they dropped their depth charges. And the K-99, allegedly, they saw another oil slick there, and they dropped depth charges on what turned out to be an oil pipeline. And then August 25th, 1944, K-67 had probably the most unique mission of the squadron. The draft board wanted to get some guy, Mr. Joe Leisner. He was on a fishing trip 23 miles southwest of Dana Point, where the draft board sent a K-67 out there to deliver his draft notice. How do you like that, huh?
Is that politically motivated?
Oh, who knows? February 14th, 1944, K-115 dropped a life raft nearby a crashed TBF, waiting for a rescue vessel. March 3rd, 1944, K-59 dropped an emergency kit to a life raft and hauled aboard an injured man. May 12th, 1944, K-6 pulled a dead man from the water and directed surface craft to rescue a sinking PBY. May 13th, 1944, K-95 rescued a Marine Corps aviator. This guy was actually a decorated war hero who had recently returned from Bougainville. And he was drifting in a life raft 25 miles from Point Conception. July 2nd, 1944, the K-95 crash landed intentionally in order to rescue 4 men that were crashed and stranded in the desert near Holtville, California. And these last several incidents, the air crews received like air medals and commendation medals for their heroism and efforts. And so, to give you again a broader perspective about the LTA program, December 1st, 1942, Naval Air Station Tillamook, Oregon was commissioned. Now, Tillamook, Oregon was basically the same design that we had here at Naval Air Station Santa Ana, with the 2 hangars perpendicular to each other. One of their hangars burnt down post-war, but one of them still exists, and it's an air museum today. And they also have some great displays about LTA history, and it gives you a chance to actually go inside the hangars. I wish we could get something like that today down here, but we'll see if that ever happens.
Who put the money in? Did they internet company?
I don't know the details. There was a big private collection there that I know there was a big falling out, and part of that went away. But it's still an open museum, and in fact, I think that even narrowed the focus more into LTA history. So another notable air station, it was in Richmond, Florida. It was the biggest World War II base in the fact that it had 3 of these wooden hangars, 2 side by side and then 1 perpendicular. And this is in southern Florida near Miami. and they were protecting the Gulf Coast and the southern East Coast from the U-boats that were devastating shipping over there. And they did a great job throughout the war, but then September 15th, 1945, a hurricane-driven fire burnt down all 3 hangars. Like, just look at that destruction. Now, I could have put a picture in there that showed the whole air station where you can see all 3 hangars are burning down, but I think this is more stark, where you see the size and the scale of these things burnt down. Now, all these wooden hangars that we know and love, they were all treated with flame retardant. But, it's a flame retardant and it's not flame proof. So if you get like a serious flame on there, they'll go. And you see many of these wooden hangars have met that demise. And that is one more reason why leaving those things empty over here is that much more of a threat. You get vagrants in there, and then we're going to have the same thing. So we've got to find a purpose for these national treasures before we lose them. Because there's only, 4 of these things left besides the ones we have here? So Naval Air Station Glencoe, Georgia was another one. Unique thing about that was they had these scalloped landing mats. And so each scallop could handle its own blimp. Now, this one, Naval Air Station Houma, Louisiana, was probably the weirdest of the wooden hangars. So, because you're right there at the end of the Mississippi River, the whole area is swampy and silty and not very stable. So rather than the doors that we're used to here, or even the orange peel type like you saw in some of the older hangars, they went with these weird domed hangar doors that moved on these tracks. And so this is a wooden hangar built exactly like the one we have here, just with these oddball doors. This is one I wish they would have saved, just to see it. It's just so weird.
Is that trying to be hurricane proof maybe? Or?
Well, actually, funny you say that, because I believe a hurricane is how it's demised. And on top of that, during the war, in fact, those doors were blown open by severe winds. Can you imagine wind pushing those gigantic doors open? God, that must have been scary. And then, not only did the wind push it open, but it pushed 2 of these airships out the other side, and they ended up wrecked. That's another thing I wish I could have put in this PowerPoint. There's so many wrecks and stories of heroism and danger involved with LTA programs. It's just, there's almost no end to it. Naval Air Station Hitchcock, Texas is another one. This base was kind of short-lived, but it was near Galveston to help, again, take care of the U-boat scourge in the Gulf of Mexico. Yes, yeah. And so this does not exist anymore. The frames for the doors still stand, and all the supports for the arches, but all the woodwork's gone. Yeah, so most of these were all built with timber from Oregon, except one of these bases, I think it was Glencoe, couldn't get the lumber from Oregon in time, so they ended up using southern pine instead of the stuff that all the others used. And I read somewhere that one of them used California redwood, but I can't speak to which one. And so another notable achievement of ZP-31 here at Naval Air Station Santa Ana was when the K-29 landed on the USS Altahama on February 4th, 1944. And allegedly that was the first landing of a K-class ship on an aircraft carrier during World War II. It wasn't the last. And, some people think this was sort of a first, but you saw they did this with dirigibles back in the day. I wish I could have gone into like the CPO mess at one of these old LTA bases during World War II. Could you imagine the sea stories of these guys that dealt with like the Macon and the Akron? And then that's your boss when you're, one of these blimp handlers? Like, they must have had some amazing sea stories. One of the stories I find fascinating from the dirigible days, getting back to that real quick, was I think it was the Akron when she came here to Southern California. What is now Miramar Marine Corps Air Station, they had a mast there for the dirigibles. And when this dirigible was coming in, you know, you got like 100 guys out there ready to grab the lines and hook it up to the mast. Well, they were having a hard time getting down because the sun beating on the thing changes the air pressure, makes it more buoyant, and you know, they were low on fuel, so it was lighter then, and there was all kinds of problems trying to get this thing down to the ground so they could hook it up to the mast. And when they finally got down to the ground handlers, you know, they all grabbed the ropes, right? And then they got this huge updraft that lifted this thing up, and 2 guys fell to their deaths trying to hold on to that thing, but one guy held on for 2 hours straight. 2 hours straight, dangling on the rope like a mile in the sky, hanging from this dirigible. And the whole crew on the dirigible was needed to keep it airworthy. And then when they finally got the chance to rescue this guy, they pulled him in 2 hours later, and the first thing he asked for was a bite to eat. He was starving. But he was like this young 18-year-old. His name was Bud Cowart, C-O-W-R-T. But you know, it sounds kind of similar to coward. And so the news totally played off his name like Bud Cowart is no coward. And you know, I'd like to pretend that, you know, by World War II he re-enlisted and he was one of these, you know, salty chiefs in the mess that was, I held on for 2 hours straight with my bare hands. But in actuality, he was a welder in the oil fields in the 1940s. And I couldn't find any details on specifically what he did during World War II. But, you know, he might have been like Sergeant York from World War I. You know, he really wanted to re-enlist when World War II came around, but he was too old and fat. You know, Bud Cowart might have been the same way. So anyway, getting back to our LTA stories. So we're familiar with the big hangars, but there were also several auxiliary bases where they could sort of do remote operations. And one of those that fell under the purview of Naval Air Station Santa Ana was Naval Auxiliary Airfield Del Mar, right next to the Del Mar racetrack. And allegedly that was really good duty. Apparently these guys would get their orders for the next day's mission from the end of the bar at like the fancy hotel there for the racetrack. So hey, good living. And maybe about 10 years ago now, they destroyed all the last vestiges of this airfield. Now, you see the picture there on the bottom right? The 5 freeways built right over one of the original mooring circles for the airfield there. But since that picture was taken, the rest of that has been destroyed. Now there is a portion of the original bridge that went onto the station that is there as sort of a memorial with some interpretive signage. But you know me, I want to save it all, so that's not good enough for me. And so here's another famous airship that did some carrier operations. So I say it's famous. It's not really famous to anybody except for those who live on Catalina Island, because October 17th, 1944, K-111 wrecked on Catalina Island up the canyon from Avalon. And not all hands, but several hands were killed. K-111 wasn't ours. It was from Naval Air Station Tillamook, ZP-33 up there. And she was down here for night navigation training. And obviously there was a hole in training there. Not to point any fingers. The Naval Auxiliary Airfield Lompoc was another one that was sort of under the purview of Naval Air Station Santa Ana. And nothing of this still exists now. Lompoc High School built their campus on top of where these mooring circles were. Naval Auxiliary Airfield Eureka was more for supporting Naval Air Station Tillamook. If you look, this is the operating base they had up there at Eureka, and way in the top corner there you can see a blimp and the mooring circles there. And a lot of these buildings are still there. I was surprised. I drove down there to check it out. K-74 is the only U.S. blimp lost to enemy action during World War II. And certainly there were many blimps who pressed home attacks against U-boats during World War II and lived to tell the tale. But the reason that K-74 did not is because as they're pressing home that attack, the depth charges won't release. And so they had the perfect approach, and they like 250 feet right over the submarine, they couldn't miss. But for some reason, the trigger failed. They weren't able to drop their bombs, and as they're pulling out to come around, gave the anti-aircraft gunners on the U-boat the perfect target. And so the anti-aircraft guns ripped a huge hole in the gas bag, and it settled into the water. And the crew was like, oh crap, there's armed depth charges on here. We better swim away from this thing. And so they swam away, and the U-boat surfaced, and they inspected the half-submerged K-74, and took pictures and recovered, sensitive items, and took them onto the U-boat and submerged and disappeared before anybody could come rescue them. And then after the U-boat was gone, the guys swam back and clung onto the thing until rescue could arrive, which when rescue finally did arrive, the whole crew survived up to this point, but a shark got one of the guys before he could be plucked out of the water. Okay, how many of you heard about Operation Fugo? Fugo. So Japan launched, I think it was about 3,000 of these bombs carrying either incendiary or explosive bombs up into the jet stream, which would carry them over to the United States, and they would detonate randomly. And so this was the first intercontinental weapon. I mean, we didn't even have bombers that could fly across the Pacific, but here they found a way to bomb. But it was very random, and they had no way of ensuring accuracy. They were hoping it would sow discord and panic, and the Army knew this, and so they kept it totally hush-hush, out of the newspapers, no information whatsoever. And so this excerpt I have here, you see, is marked confidential. This is just from the first few months. So the very first Japanese balloon bomb was recovered floating in the water 60 miles south of San Pedro. And you can see that marked right there, 66 miles south of San Pedro. November 4th, 1944. And to this day, there were only like 300 some odd balloons recovered, but thousands were launched. And the last one to be recovered was like in 2014, somebody found one in the woods somewhere. So that being said, these things are still out there, but don't let them get you. You don't want to be the last casualty of World War II.
I thought most of them landed out in Oregon, Washington, and went into that area.
I mean, some of them landed as far east as Michigan. So I had some follow-on images, but they were just too difficult for me to get into here in a practical way, because this shows sort of like the whole northern continent, but these were happening so frequently that they ended up breaking these down into smaller maps and all that. So I figured I'd just summarize. This shows at least sort of how it began.
Did they intervene any of these at all, or could they?
Yeah, they came up with TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures to shoot these things down. And there was a whole big thing about how they were supposed to respond when they spotted one, and what they were going to do. And also, take note of the picture here. You see, they captured some of them complete enough to experiment with, and you see they're doing that at an LTA facility. I don't know which one. Now, moving on to the Cold War real quick. These Japanese balloon bombs inspired during the Cold War, when we were desperate to know what the Soviets were capable of and what their intentions were. We were desperate to know what the Soviets were doing. And so they took the concept of these balloon bombs and put cameras and other sensing devices on them and sent them over the Soviet Union. I think less than 50 of them were recovered. This was pre-U-2. So in the interim between the end of World War II and before 1955, when they could get the U-2 program going, they used these bombs. Yeah, Operation Gentrix. And so, to sort of reiterate, these, before I move on, the only known fatalities from this balloon bomb campaign was a Sunday school group that was in Southern Oregon on like a sort of trip into the wilderness. A 25-year-old pregnant woman who was the Sunday school teacher and 5 kids were all ripped to shreds when they found this thing in the woods. They didn't know what it was. I have the pictures, and it's grisly. It's so bad. I was like, I'm not even going to put that in my presentation because it's no bueno. So anyway, to reiterate what LTA did, it was to protect Allied ships at sea. So, ships would leave the harbor under the cover of, like in the early morning hours, and these balloons, blimps would shadow these ships and convoys at least until nightfall when they were relatively safe. Blacked out convoy ships would be difficult to track and to see. And then, here's some more images of that. Another vital function that they performed was search and rescue for downed aviators and, also ships in trouble. And so this particular picture, I don't think it's from our squadron, but this is the only image I can find on the net that actually said in the caption that it was being rescued by a K-class blimp. And so, again, this is mostly focused on World War II, but, we talked about submarines and balloons fighting each other so much, I thought I'd kind of bring that back around. And in 1952, the USS Sea Poacher, one of our submarines, rescued and towed a disabled K-class blimp, towed it 40 miles to NAS Key West. How's that for irony? And so, I love the structures, I love the history, but, another part of what makes this whole story fascinating is the people. The greatest generation, the ones that said, I'll stand up and fight and put my life on the line. Of course, we've had people do that for generations, but, there never in modern history have you had a generation where so many people signed up to do their part. And another fascinating aspect of this is it's sort of the premiere of women getting involved in the armed forces. Now, women did have a role during World War I, in strictly secretarial work, and also switchboard work and stuff like that. But by World War II, the jobs that they could do just multiplied. Of course, that was an age when people were very protective of women. They didn't want women to get hurt. And so, it was the man's job to go out there and face the bullets, but, women were all the more willing to step up and do their part to bring their boys home. And, the picture on the left here, I think that's NAS Lakehurst, but the picture on the right, that's right here at NAS Santa Ana. And then these two pictures are right here at NAS Santa Ana. And so, she's climbing up that weather vane in a skirt, mind you, in a place that's known for its wind. And, there's a link trainer, to train pilots for instruments and stuff like that. And also women played a big part in communications. But communications is vital to every military installation. That's one thing that really bums me out about our LTA here, is they tore down the original headquarters building. Like, that would be a perfect building to adaptively reuse and turn into an office building or a community center or something like that. But I don't know, some money-minded person in the city decided, we'll just tear it down. We don't need the liability. It's a damn shame. But, that would have been like the communications hub for the base, and would have been fascinating to go through and just look for old things that survived. But I also want to point out the use of pigeons for communication. And so because blimps are so slow-moving, if you are under radio silence, you just put a message on its foot and it, put it out the window and it'll fly home. And this particular picture, you see oranges in the background. And so for the longest time, I wanted to figure out where exactly the pigeon loft was, where they kept all the pigeons, and where this picture was taken. And I think I narrowed it down. Or, excuse me, I did narrow it down. This map lists where all that stuff was. So that pigeon loft right there. And so this was all orange groves, and you can see that in some of the old aerial photographs and stuff. And for this side of the room, right there, that's where the pigeon loft was. And this is that orange grove you see in the background behind her. Because, again, I have no official affiliation with Tustin. I'm just a history nerd that was fortunate enough to wander in one day and the museum was like, hey, you want to give a talk on what you know? And so I unfortunately don't know anything about the fate of those hangars. And I am right there beside you and wanting to do everything I can to save those things.
Were the blimps all the same size? You mentioned Hangars and Hangars. Were they all the same size or were they different sizes?
Each class was a different size. So like the L class was sort of like the Goodyear blimp that you remember as a kid. And the K class blimps were, what, like 200 feet? And then the biggest ones were like 400 feet or something ridiculous like that. So again, can you imagine something that big getting pushed around by the wind and swinging around like that? And then watch this. Oh. What a catastrophe. That's how you break your airship. So interestingly enough, the gas bags that were used in the airships during World War I, the ones that were bombing London, their gas bags were made out of cow intestine. And so like hundreds of thousands of cows went into each gas bag, or at least into each airship. Should I give you back your museum? Or? I made it to 8:30, right? I could keep talking about this all day, so. Thank you, thank you.